Good day, everyone. So, I am here today to represent to you the functional theory and language acquisition. But first of all, I would like to greet our instructor, Madam Lorly P. Caperida. And I would like also to introduce myself. I am Emeline G. Hinay, a BS English 1 student from Northeastern Mindanao State University, Maharlika, Bislig City campus. So today, I am going to represent to you the topic, the functional theory and language acquisition, in which I have prepared these objectives that first you will get to learn on the language acquisition and functional theories that has been debated by the linguist. Second, you will also get some knowledge on how an infant acquired language through the stages of language acquisition. Third, you can also differentiate the first and second language acquisition. And last is you will get to be amazed on what our brain can do to acquire language. So let's start on the first slide of this presentation. So this is language acquisition. So language acquisition is the process by which humans acquired the capacity to perceive and comprehend language, as well as to produce and use words to communicate. It means that language acquisition is acquired by humans. It's a capacity to perceive and comprehend language, as well as to produce and to use the words to communicate with others. Second is it is usually refers to first language acquisition, which studies infants' acquisition of their native language. So language acquisition can also be refers to first language acquisition that can observe the infants on how they acquired the language. We have theories of language acquisition. Number one is imitation, Nativism, or Behaviorist. It is based on the empiricist or behavioral approach, which means empirical behaviorism, a combination of Skinner radical behaviorism and Cantor's interbehaviorism that focusing on human development. Language acquisition theories, another is number two, innateness or mentalism, based on the rationalistic or mentalist approach, in which language learning is innate ability, own grammar and grammatical sentences, presented by Noam Chomsky, and it consists in the thoughts that we have innate elements which we're born with that permits us to learn language easily. Chomsky and his mentalist followers claim that a child learns his first language through cognitive learning. So, which means that the innateness or mentalist theory, it's based on the rationalistic or mentalist approach, which language learning is innate ability and own grammar and grammatical sentences. This innateness or mentalist theory is represented by Noam Chomsky, and it consists of thoughts that innate elements in which we're born with. According to Noam Chomsky, the child is born with the mental capacity for working out the underlying system to the jumble of sounds which he hears. The mental grammar is part of his cognitive framework, and nothing he hears stores in his brain until he has matched it against what he already knows and found a correct place for it with this framework. He added that a child is born with some innate mental capacity which helps the child to process all the language. The third theories of language acquisition is the cognition, which is based on cognitive psychological approach. We have to tackle first the psychology, means that it's relatively focuses on how we think, and cognitive is knowing They attempt to apply the scientific approach to human behavior. Psychologists attempt to create rules and explanation of humans' behavior and eventually generalize them to everyone's behavior. The approach came about in part due to dissatisfaction with the behavioral approach, which focused on our visible behavior without understanding the internal processes create them. So the cognition is based on cognitive psychological approach. So psychologists are using the approach to human behavior, and the human behavior eventually generalize them to everyone's behavior. The fourth theories of language acquisition is the recent view of language comes from correctionism. It is an approach in the field of cognitive science that hopes to explain mental phenomena using artificial neural networks. They present a cognitive theory based on simultaneously signal activity via connections that can be represented numerically, where learning occurs by modifying connections strength on experience base. So which means that the recent view of language comes from correctionism. It approach the field of cognitive science that explain mental phenomena using artificial neural network. So, this modifying the connection that's strength on experience base. So, it means that the experience is the connections through this language acquisition. We have to explain the first language acquisition. So, number one, imitation, nativism, or the behavioral perspectives. This theory of learning was very influential in the 1940s and 1950s. Imitation. This means that the child has first language imitate utterances of his parents. However, this new theory has been proved to be incomplete, and based on its limitations, emerged another theory, which means that the imitation theory, that this theory of learning of language, that the child first language imitate utterances from the people, from the parents, or from the caregiver that around them. However, this theory has been proved to be incomplete. That is why, because of these limitations and incomplete of this theory, there is another theory that emerged. The second explanation for the first language acquisition. Number one, imitation. Number two, repetition. Number three, memorization. Then number four, controlled drilling. And number five, reinforcement. So, imitation. The children learns to speak by imitating the utterances heard around them, which means that everything the children learn or hear from the parents, from the people around them, they can imitate it. They can use it to speak. They can use the language in a way that they want it to be. The second is the repetition. The children strengthen the responses by the repetitions, corrections, and other reactions that adults provide. So by the children, when the children learns another language from their parents, they're going to repetition, and then corrections. Then the parents, the adults, they're going to correct the child. The next is the memorization. General perception is that there is no differences between the way we learn a language and the way one learns to do anything else. So, memorization is the general perception that you are going to learn, that you are going to memorize what you learned, and you are going to apply that. Number four is controlled drilling. Main focus is on inducing the child to behave with the help of mechanical drills and exercises. Number five is reinforcement. Learning is to controlled by the condition under which it take place, and that as long as individuals are subjected on the same condition. They will learn in the same condition. So as what I have told you before, that there is proved to be incomplete theory, and it's emerged another theory. And one of that theory is the theory of INNATISM or innateness. This theory was advocated by Noam Chomsky. He published a criticism of the behaviorist theory in 1957, while he focuses mainly on the language approach. This means that parents do not typically speaking romantically complete sentences when they addresses their children. They do not use academic language in that daily normal life. So, Chomsky concluded that children must have an internal capacity for language acquisition. So here, as you can see, Chomsky, in the late 1950s, Chomsky contended that all humans possess an innate capacity of language. Activated in infancy by minimal environmental stimuli, he has elaborated and revised this theory of language acquisition ever since. Chomsky's ideas have profoundly affected linguistics and mind science in general. When the theory of innateness has been claimed by Noam Chomsky, there is some people criticize it. So here, innate theory is criticized for, number one, is the rule of adult speech cannot be ruled out in providing a means of enabling children to work out the regularities for themselves. Number two, it has proved difficult to formulate the detailed properties of LAD and controversial manner, in that light of change in generative linguistic theory that have taken place later years. Meanwhile, alternative accounts of the acquisition process evolve. Then third, that there are principles of grammar that cannot be learned on the basis of positive input alone. So that is how the critics criticize the theory of innate by Noam Chomsky. Cognitive theory. Main argument is language acquisition must be viewed within the context of a child's intellectual development. Linguistic structures will emerge only if there is an already established. So it means to say that the main argument of this cognitive theory is the language acquisition must be viewed within the context of the child's intellectual development. Cognitive theory is being criticized also. According to the critics, that it is highly difficult to show precise correlations between specific cognition behaviors and linguistics features at the very early stages of language acquisition as the children becomes linguistically advanced in the course of time. Comes from another theory, the behaviorist theory. Focuses on the idea that all behaviors are learned through interaction with the environment. So the behaviorist theory focuses on the idea of the behavior are learned through interaction with the environment. But there are two evidence used to criticize behaviorist theory. The first evidence here is based on the kind of language children produce. Number one, the first piece of evidence taken from the way children handle irregular grammatical patterns. While encountering irregular items, there is stage when they replace forms based on the irregular patterns of language. Secondly, gradually they switch over to the process of analogy. Means analogy is a reasoning process as they start working out for themselves. And the second evidence is based on what children do not produce. Number one is the other evidence is based on the way children seem unable to imitate adults' grammatical constructions exactly. So, second is best-known demonstration of this principle is provided by American psycholinguistics David McNeill in 1933. Third, thus, language acquisition is more a matter of maturity than of imitation. So these two evidences is used to criticize the behaviorist theory. So we have come up to language acquisition device, which means language acquisition device or LAD, postulated organ of the brain that is supposed to function as a cognitical device for learning symbolic language. So example is the language acquisition. So this one, the language acquisition device or LAD is a claim from language acquisition research proposed by Noam Chomsky in 1960s. The LAD concept is a purported instinctive mental capacity which enables an infant to acquire and produce language. It is a component of Nativist theory of language. So according to Chomsky, that is biologically based, which means that the human species has evolved a brain with neural circuits into a linguistic information at birth. So according to Noam Chomsky, that is biologically based, or that means that the human species has evolved a brain with neural circuits into a linguistic information at birth. So it is also means that the child's natural predisposition to learn language is triggered by human speech and audiences. So it is important that the interaction with the child and adults to get that connections, because that is triggered by the human LAD, which is the infants need that connection to have that pathways to learn the language. So the child brain is able to interpret what he or she has according to the underlying principles or structures it already contains. LAD or language acquisition device, this natural mental ability has become known as language acquisition device or LAD. We had 100 billion brain cells, including millions that control language. The brain grows by making connections between each cells. Most of these brain cells are there, lying and waiting, and they need to be connected. Why? Why they need to be connected? It is because they need to be connected in order to function. And what allows the brain cell to be connected? It is the experience. It allows the brain to be connected. These connections form pathways in the brain, and these pathways are the foundation for lifelong learning and well-being of a child. So it means to say that the child needs that connections, need that experience to function well and to have that lifelong learning and well-being. Language acquisition device, another information that our brain grows more during the first 3 years of life than any other time. So this means that what happens to a child during the first 3 years will influence that person's ability to learn, wellness, health, and social interaction. So with language acquisition device, that we know that our brain have that millions of brain cells, and this first 3 years of life of that child is very critical, because this means that they are going to have that connections in order to get that ability to learn. So you have to make out the best of the child, interact them into another human being able to improve and enhance their ability to learn. So we are going to move on our next slides, the stages of language acquisition. So the stages of language acquisitions here, as you can see, we have infants here, pictures of infants crying. That is the first stage of language acquisition of the infants. It's crying. Newborn baby cry a lot, but for newborns, crying is the only way to communicate for a while. So if the newborn is crying, you can predict what is or how the baby feel. Maybe they need something, maybe they need comfort, maybe they need to change the diaper, or maybe they have hurt somewhere. So that is the language, the first stage of language acquisition from the infants. They use this language, crying, to get what they want, to satisfy their needs. So I have here video for you to view.
Needs to get used to their new environment. Crying and screaming is perfectly normal for babies and is an important tool of self-expression. Even well-cared-for babies can cry for a long time. Neither the baby nor their parents can do anything about it.
The crying baby is not out to annoy their parents. The baby is crying because it has an unfulfilled need. When a baby cries, it's important for parents to respond. They need to realize that baby is trying to show them something, and they should try to respond to that.
So as you can see, this is just an example on how the baby needs something. They cry because they need something, and the adults or the caregiver, the parents, should need to address that. Our next slide of this presentation. So here, this is the number 2 of the stages of language acquisition, which is cooing. And it happens on the 3rd month old baby. So from newborn, over the next few weeks and months, we learn to explore our vocal tract. And it includes producing extended vowel sounds. I have prepared here some videos for that. I am going to So that is the baby cooing. Number 3 is reduplicating babbling. It happens on the 6-month-old babies. So we start combining consonants and vowel sounds into syllables. We begin by reduplicating the same syllables over and over, or reduplicating babbling. So during this stage, parents often think that their child is producing their first word, like mama, dada, but in fact, they're just reduplicating babbling. I have prepared for you a video.
Bubbles! Whoa! Bubbles!
So that is how the child reduplicating babbling. So the next stage of language acquisition is the variegated babbling. It happens on the 8-month-old babies. So which involves combining more multiple syllable sounds. Eventually, we start producing individual words. A child's first words are usually things that they see in their immediate environment and have direct experience. For example, when the child wants banana, and because she is variegated babbling, so she will say that instead banana, she will say nana, just like that. That is example of a child variegated babbling. 5 is telegraphic speech. It happens on 2-year-old child. So, telegraphic speech, we start putting words together, and the two words like night night, wanna go night night, or if a child wants something to eat or he wants something food, he will say or I want to eat, he will say on a Filipino mother, some of their child wants to eat, the child will say ko, like that. So that's an example, telegraphic speech, and it happens on the second years of the child. Next, the language comprehension leads language production. It means that children can understand a lot more language than they're able to produce. And once they're at this stage, they've learned a lot of words and are making rapid progress, experimenting more with the morphology in the language. This often results in a number of errors based on overgeneralization or the incorrect application of grammatical rules. During this time, children also trying to experiment of a language. They're trying to narrow down semantic domains or meanings for each words. Or, for example, the child will see, my foot hurts. The adult will say, oh, you hurt? What happened to your feet? Then the child will say, not feet, foot. That is how the child is going to experiment rules, some semantic language that they are trying to narrow down the semantic domains and the meaning of that word as well is overextension. When the child trying to narrow down the semantic domains or the meaning of each words, this often results in a number of overextension. So overextension where children are applying a broader semantic range to a word than it used in adult language. Example, a conversation between a father and a daughter. They are at the zoo and the daddy say, look, sweetie, what is that? What is that? Look, sweetie, what is that? Then the child will say, kitty. And the daddy say, no, it's a lion. And the child will say, kitty. That is how the child is going to overextension or extension. They're going to apply a broader semantics range to a word than it used in the adult language. So we move on to the second language acquisition. So what is second language acquisition? Second language acquisition, or SLA, is learning a second language after the first language is already learned. Anyone can learn a second language, but children usually find it easier. In fact, this is a process of learning and it occurs actively and consciously through explicit instructions and education. Moreover, according to the linguist Stephen KRASHEN, second language acquisition occurs in 5 stages. So that the second language acquisition, or SLA, is learning a language after you learn the first language. So there is no limitation because anyone can learn the second language. Any language you want to learn, you can. But the children usually find it more easier than the adults. According to linguist Stephen KRASHEN, that the second language acquisition occurs in 5 stages. So we're going to know what is that 5 stages of second language acquisition. The 5 stages of second language acquisition by Stephen KRASHEN. Number 1 is the reproduction. Number 2 is early production. Number 3, speech emergence. Number 4, immediate fluency. Number 5, advanced fluency. So let's go back to the first. So, according to Stephen KRASHEN, there are 5 stages of second language acquisition. Number 1 is the reproduction, which means at this stage of the learners learns terms of new language and practice them. So they are going to learn the language and they are going to practice it. Second is the early production, which the learners can speak in short phrases of 1 or 2 phrases. They also collect new words. So in early production, the learners of the second language can speak short phrases or 2 phrases, and they are also having some vocabularies they collect from that language. Number 3 is the speech emergence. This stage, learners know thousands of words and can communicate using simple questions and phrases. Immediate fluency is the learners have an advanced vocabulary and used more complicated sentence structures. They can also share opinions and thoughts. Number 5 is the advanced fluency. By this stage, learners will finally have several years of experience and can function at a level close to a native speaker. So what do you mean by this is that in the advanced fluency of second language acquisition, the advanced fluency, the learners will finally have several years of learning that language. They have experience already to function then like that native speaker of that language. We are going to differentiate between the first language acquisition and second language acquisition. So first, the definition. The first language acquisition is children's acquisition of their native language, while second language acquisition is learning a language after acquiring the mother tongue. So the definition here is the first language acquisition, or the FLA, is when a child acquire that language by their native language. And second language acquisition is learning a language, or you have to learn that language at school after acquiring the mother tongue process. While first language acquisition is subconscious process, second language acquisition occurs actively and consciously. It means that the first language acquisition is subconscious. It means that you didn't learn it from school. It happens on you. But the second language acquisition, it occurs actively and consciously. You learned it. You practice it. That is not your native language. So, for the educational instructions, the first language acquisition does not require explicit instructions on education, while second language acquisition requires explicit instructions and education. Native-like fluency. Since first language acquisition involves acquiring the native language, speakers are fluent in their first language. However, it is often difficult to reach a native-like fluency with the second language. As for the summary of this presentation, so language acquisition is the process through which human gains the ability to be aware of language and understand it, as well as to produce and use words and sentences to communicate. It means that language acquisition is the process through which human gain that ability to be aware of the language and understand it, as well as to produce it and then use that words to communicate. So the first language acquisition is the children acquisition of their native language since at birth. That is the first language acquisition. Moreover, first language acquisition is a subconscious process, which means that they acquired it without even conscious about the grammatical rules or sentences structures. Second language acquisition is an active and conscious process, which means that they learned the grammatical rules, the phonology, the syntax, the phrases, the semantic, the pragmatics, and the sentences structures. That is the reason why it is difficult and very challenging to be fluent on the second language acquisition. So, why learning a second language is active and lots of effort? It is because you have to use it. You will never learn the language unless you have to actively use it. You must use the language to become fluent to it, so that you will become familiar with its rules. Sentences structures, vocabularies, pronunciations, and many more concepts. You have to actively use the language to be able to master or to become near native speaker or fluency. Can it be possible for a child to acquire two first language? The answer is yes, it's possible. It's possible to a child to acquire two first language. For example, a dad is a French and a mom is a Spanish. The baby is exposed to this language at the same time. So the baby, it says to have two first language. To remember that our brain had 100 billion brain cells. How amazing! How amazing and interesting that was. As for infants, on the first 3 years of life is very critical. So, the early, the better. At some point, the brain has to start what they called pruning, taking away some of those connections. And it does this through what they called use it or lose it. So, it means that the child needs that connection in order to have that pathways of the brain that is effectively for learning a language. So, the connections that the brain uses the most, the experiences that the child has most often used, are the connections that are going to stay in the brain and the pathways that are going to be the strongest. Anything that the child maybe experiences just occasionally, that is eventually be lost. So, what's happening is the brain here is preparing the child for the environment that the child lives in. The child must have that pathways. As for the conclusion, remember that there have critics that bash Noam Chomsky's theory. So, the critics have bashed Noam Chomsky for 50 years. His concept that language is innate endures. Each human beings have already that capacity to learn language. That's the belief of Noam Chomsky, that human beings have that capacity already to learn language. And Noam Chomsky believed that humans share a universal grammar that ties all language together. He revised his theories in 1960, LAD, or have been a basis on his theory that language is biologically based. So it is clear that there is something very special about our brains that enable us to master a natural language. LAD, or language acquisition device, is a hypothetical hardwired into the brain that help children rapidly learn and understand language. Noam Chomsky used LAD, or language acquisition device, to explain just how amazingly children are able to acquire language abilities, as well as accounting for the innate understanding of grammar, and syntax that children possesses. So, LAD, or language acquisition device, is a tool that Noam Chomsky uses to explain on how the children are able to acquire language ability as well as innate understanding on the grammar and the syntax the children possesses. Keep in mind that LAD is a theoretical concept. There isn't a section of the brain with language acquisition device printed on it and a big switch to turn on and learn a new language. Rather, it's used to explain what are most likely hundreds of thousands of underlying processes that humans have in their brains that have evolved to make us particularly exceptional at learning and understanding language. Now that we have already a knowledge about the theories, functions of language, as well as those evidences that have been revealed to us by the linguists and others, we might be lucky. However, this is a responsibility that lies within each one of us. It is still up to us on how to improve, enhance, and develop that ability that a child has, which is very essential, such as language acquisition. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you. God bless us.